Welcome to the Baptist broadcast. Church polity and leftist ideology. What do those two things have to do with one another? And what I want to talk about in this installment is that relationship right there, church polity and leftist ideology. And it seems like when we look, if we just look at recent history, there is a brand of church polity, a specific kind of church polity, that is a lot more affected by leftist ideology when it infects that particular tradition or whatever you want to call it than others. So, for example, if you have several, not independent, but if you have several individual or particular churches that are related to one another by means of some kind of a hierarchical governing body. Let's go the softest form possible and look at something like Presbyterianism. And a Presbyterian would say, well, we wouldn't really call it hierarchical. That's my phraseology. I know that a Presbyterian would probably not call it hierarchical. The only reason I call it hierarchical is that you have a governing body that is external to, in some measure, an individual local church. You think of the presbytery, for example. Now, let's say you have a presbytery, and the property of the local churches that are part of the presbytery all accrue to the presbytery. So the presbytery, like, for example, owns the properties. The properties are not owned outrightly by the local churches that utilize those properties. Okay, and this has made it very difficult in the past for certain local churches that are in a presbytery that goes south to do anything really about it logistically. They either have to, leave and find somewhere else to worship, which has happened in the past, or because they have a vested interest, in maintaining that property, there are things that are keeping them from just making a decision based on conscience. They choose to stay, and they kind of adapt to, whatever it is that is being standardized by the presbytery, good or bad, right? So, and that's the softest form. There's a lot of independency in Presbyterianism, relatively speaking. So there's a lot more independency in Presbyterianism than there is in Roman Catholicism, for example. And in fact, Presbyterianism was a positive step, right? If you're just looking at the big scheme of things, and what the reformers had to work with, it was a step in the right direction. It was reining in the kind of rampant, power-drunk, central government that was, so popular and influential in Romish practice. And so it was definitely a step in the right direction, but it's still got powers that be that exist outside of the local church. And of course, we as Baptists would say there is a power which exists outside of the local church, but the only power that we affirm existing outside of the local church is Christ himself. All right, and we don't think that there is any need for any sort of governing body that exists outside of the local church. In all of the instances in the New Testament, for example, they're descriptive, first of all, and second of all, we would just say that they weren't normative, right? The situations that rise up, in the New Testament, where you have apostles adjudicating on certain situations that are going on in local churches, certainly doesn't vindicate by itself a governing body that should continue on outside of the polity of the local church. And just if you just look at the practical, and I know that, just looking at the practical, let's say practical ills, things that happen practically that aren't necessarily desirable, I know that by itself doesn't prove one doctrine right or wrong, okay? But I'm just saying that when you look at the day and age that we live in now, And you've got to consider the fact that, by and large, our society does not even agree on a subset or just a basic, a fundamental set of moral principles. Our society can't even get on agreement concerning those things. And you even look at the parachurch ministries that you see that have the loudest voices, and not even they can get on the same page when it comes to fundamental principles. The structure of the family, the place of men and women in society. These things that would have been all agreed upon by most people, even people who perhaps weren't even Christians. Going back to the 18th and 17th centuries, all of those things would have been, by and large, agreed upon in society. That's not the case today. And so whereas you may have had a baseline of moral statutes or standards that existed and everybody kind of ascended to those things, by and large, making it easier for hierarchical church government to kind of exist and persist, today you don't have those standards that are agreed upon. So when you have gross moral sin come into an institution that is hierarchically structured, the softest version of which I could think of is something like Presbyterianism, and then you have like Anglicanism, and then your even more stronger forms of Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy to some extent. Then there's no, when you're let's say you're just a local parish involved in that system, or a local church or congregation involved in that system, there's really no way to fight it and to protect your own congregation unless you take serious losses. So there's a motive for a lot of these congregations and for a lot of the leadership to want to stay within their presbyteries or their districts or whatever, because they know there is going to be a lot of monetary loss and loss of assets if they are to leave, and they're going to have to kind of start from scratch. So it's kind of like when you sign a contract with a bank on a mortgage, and let's say you buy a $200,000 house and you have $100,000 in equity that you were able to put down as a down payment. And so half the house is paid for essentially. But if you can't make the payment on the rest of that $100,000 and your house gets basically repoed you have to foreclose on it, you lose the equity, right? And that provides a motive for you to earn an income so that you can make payments on that second half of the cost of that home. Well, why is that any different when you get into a hierarchical situation where you have all of these logistical issues that rise or fall based on your relationship to the central governing body of that institution? It really doesn't change, right? The principle stays the same as it does with someone who's trying to pay off a mortgage. You have a motivation to stay in, because otherwise there's going to be a great deal of loss, a great deal of earthly loss, and it's just not a form of government that's conducive to making the right decisions, biblical decisions based on conscience, concerning what you're going to do. Whenever a bad or morally perverse doctrine is now being taught in that particular institution. This happens with seminaries all the time and universities, where professors are kind of coerced to remain under the umbrella of, the head of the faculty, the president or the board or whatever that runs those institutions. And even if they don't agree with the policies, they stay and they make the compromise so that they can keep the six-figure income or whatever it is. And, these local parishes and local churches get put in the same situation whenever they're tied to a central governing authority that controls virtually their property. And so that, they're unable to make very good, clear biblical decisions based on what to do if some terrible doctrine comes in. So how does independency answer this, right? And you might say, well, independency is terrible because there is no central authority that enforces a kind of universal doctrinal standard, across the board. So, what you get in one independent church is not going to be what you get in the next independent church, the next town over, right? And that's very true, actually. why does that concern us? Would be my question. Actually, that doesn't concern us at all. What concerns us, because the local church, I mean, every time you see Paul writing to the local church, he's always admonishing them to care for and nurture those that are closest to them. So really, what the guys are doing in the next town over, that doesn't concern me. Would it be? Is it lamentable? Perhaps, but it really, I have no moral obligation to them. Really, biblically, I don't. And maybe if I come into contact with them or whatever, I have the obligation to admonish them or to exhort them to repentance or something like that. But structurally, logistically, financially, authoritatively or whatever, I have no accountability over them, right? So why would that concern me? Yeah, sure, it might be different, but it's kind of like, what Rome was trying to say to Martin Luther. Well, if you translate the scriptures into the vulgar tongue and everyone can, read it and interpret it, then this is going to result in, a suicide of orthodoxy. And Luther said, okay, so what if it does? But the fact of the matter is that the truth will be published abroad. And I say the same thing to those who say, well, you're not going to have any kind of uniformity among visible local churches. And I say, okay, whatever. I have no moral obligation to the guy in the next town. I just don't. It's not biblically stated that I do. And so, sure, they may go off the cliff, and that would be lamentable and sad and everything else, and I would exhort them and admonish them maybe through emails or, show up at their door one day and talk to the pastor or whatever, but I don't have any ecclesiastical authority or accountability over them. So I just that objection wouldn't concern me. I would just say, well, okay, so what? If one independent church isn't looking like the other independent church, is it lamentable? Sure, but is it my responsibility? No, it's not. And so I would just go on with my life, and I would hope that my local church would just go on with their life as well, trying to be obedient to Christ according to His Word. And that right there is key. Because the reality of it is that a local church that is independent from some kind of hierarchical governing structure, standard, or authority has the freedom and liberty to obey the Lord Jesus Christ according to conscience. Whereas there are all sorts of compulsory controls on local churches who belong to hierarchical church government that prevent them from making a clear, thoughtful decision based on conscience and what they believe the Bible actually teaches. Okay, so an independent church, and when I say independent church, this isn't a Baptist distinctive. There are Paedo-Baptists who were independents and probably still are somewhere. Thinking of, the Plymouth Pilgrims who came over, they were independent. Thinking of John Owen and Thomas Goodwin and others who were independent. Paedo-Baptist, so this isn't just a Baptist thing, but I will say that the Baptists have been the most consistent in observing independent church polity throughout the years. And what has it afforded us? Well, I know I'm not always confident. Okay, so I'm not always confident. If I go to a church in the PCA. And we know the PCUSA is down the tubes, right? So you know what you're going to get when you go to a church in the PCUSA. And you know what you're going to get because the PCUSA tells you what they believe, and you know that any church that has yoked themselves to that and exists within that structure, within that body, is going to be teaching something along the same lines, right? The PCA is going the same direction. So I know that, if I go to a church that's in the PCA, chances are I could encounter a church like that. So it obviously hasn't gone as far as the PCUSA, but it's going there. Now, it's easy. It's relatively easy to find a Baptist church, and we'll get to denominations here in a minute, like the SBC, but you might find a Baptist church in the SBC, or a Baptist church that's not in the SBC, that is actually a solid Baptist church in terms of a grasp of the gospel, conservative understanding of the scriptures, conservative understanding of anthropology, which is a big deal now. And that is all across the country you can find Baptist churches like that. And I'm not saying that you can't find Presbyterian churches like that all across the country, but I am saying that part of the reason Baptists have been so consistent in their conservatism is because of the independency that is inherent within Baptist theology and ecclesiology. And when you have, let's take this back to kind of a national political context. Kuyper was the prime minister of the Netherlands, and when he wrote on the doctrine of the church, he wrote that the churches in America have been more free than the churches at any time in history to actually live according to the law of God and to do what churches are called to do according to the scriptures. And of course, there's all sorts of diversity among these independent churches, and of course there are independent churches that you would in no wise want to be a part of because they're probably heretics or apostates or whatever. But there are plenty of independent churches that you would want to be a part of that are free because they're not being controlled by the state. They're free to do missions work. They're free, to do all of the things that churches are called to do according to the New Testament. These churches are able to do that, and that's because of the independency afforded by the United States of America and the Constitution. This context is great for local churches because local churches are able to do what they're supposed to be doing according to conscience, or what they believe they're supposed to be doing according to conscience. Is there error? Sure, of course there is. But if you just boil that down and that freedom, that liberty down to the local church, my local church, the reality of the matter is we are not bound to any sort of governing body above us. And we exist in the United States, which means that we're not being told what to do by some crown or some monarch, right? So we actually, as an independent and local church, have the ability and the potential to carry out our mission, our Bible-given mission, so to speak, in a way that a church that's controlled by an apostate denomination can't do, obviously. Or in a way that a church that is controlled by a socialist communist government can't do, okay? So the independency is, yes, if you just think about, taking away the hierarchical authority, of course there's going to be less uniformity. But is there going to be more potentiality and ability for Orthodox Christians to do what they're supposed to do? And the answer is absolutely yes. So it's just kind of like you've taken the restraints off of Orthodox Christianity, and now it can go forth and achieve its goal. Again, this doesn't prove anything about independency. It doesn't prove that it's true in and of itself, because all this could be true, and yet independency still be unbiblical. Okay, so I'm not making a case per se for independent church polity, although I obviously believe that I can. This episode is just that's not within the scope of this episode. I'm just saying that pragmatically speaking, and when you look at it practically speaking, can my local church meet her biblically ordained ends better than a church who is under the thumb of an emperor or a king or queen or an apostate hierarchical church government? And the answer is yes. My local church can meet that end in a more effective way than a church under somebody else's thumb can meet that end, right? And that's all I really want to say is that when you put the church and the discussion of the church into a political context, like I'm trying to do here, and you ask the question, what church polity keeps congregations safest from something like leftist ideology? It's going to be independency every single time. And I'll say this, it's going to be independency and congregationalism together. I understand that there can be independent churches that have elder rule and have no congregational input whatsoever. That's not what I'm talking about here. The kind of independency I'm talking about here gives an authority to congregations to account for what's going on or to be accountable for what's going on in their congregations, and that applies to what they're being taught. They have to be discerning congregation. And this is what you see in the Savoy Standards. This is what you see in the Second London Confession, is that there is an onus on the congregation to be discerning about what's being preached from the pulpit. And that gives the congregation ownership such that even if there was a false teacher in their midst, they would both have the power and the responsibility to remove that person from themselves, right? And but that power and responsibility wouldn't be there, right, if this was all governed hierarchically. All right. So anyway, I hope this was helpful. Just think about, just ask the question: what form of church polity, what form of church government, serves as the best antidote to liberal or leftist ideology? And I think just considering all the variables, you're going to have to say something like independency and congregationalism. God bless you guys. If this video was helpful, please click the subscribe button and the bell for continued notifications so you can see when we drop new content. Also, give me a thumbs up if it was useful for you, and share it because it might be useful for someone else. God bless.